Hello students, today we will see one chapter from supplementary reading, that is A Triumph of Surgery, written by James Harriet. James Harriet was born on 3rd October 1916 and he died in 1995 in England. How we will go upon this particular period, this particular lecture, let me tell you, because after viewing this lecture, you will have to read the original text. First, I will deal with major characters. They are Tricky, a very small and fatty dog. Second, Mrs. Humphrey, she is very rich and emotional lady. And third is Dr. Harriet, who is surgeon of animals, or veterinary surgeon, you can say. Now, next we will have theme of the story. That is, in short, I have written here, you can see blind love. Then after, what is the actual story, what is essential of the story, that is gist of the story we will see. And lastly, I will summarize the story. After that, we have questions, but those questions you will be answering by your own. So let us begin with the major characters. First character we have Tricky. As I told you, Tricky is a small and fatty dog. Now, why and how he became fatty? See, Tricky was a pet, lovely pet of the Mrs. Humphrey, and she was very rich and she was pampering that dog too much. That means it was excessive love of Mrs. Humphrey to cause the weight of Tricky. Tricky became fat because he was greedy dog. He was so much fascinated to food. He never ever denied any time of the day. It may be the night, it may be the day, always he wants to eat, and because of the love, Mrs. Humphrey never denied him the food, and that is the reason he put on the weight. Later on that became the headache for the Mrs. Humphrey also, and illness for Tricky. He definitely fell ill, and because of that he had to be admitted in the hospital. So this was Tricky in short. Mrs. Humphrey, second major character. Mrs. Humphrey is very rich lady and she was very dog loving kind of lady. She was emotional also, and she had love for Tricky too much. She had kept so many maids and servants to look after her house, and obviously Tricky was the priority to take care of above everything, we can say. So Mrs. Humphrey was allowing Tricky to have anything, anytime. She was even thinking, my dog, my lovely pet is being seen lethargic, meaning he was sometimes dull. So why she was thinking, why he has been not running or not being active in the house. That is why Mrs. Humphrey made certain changes in his diet. She add some cod liver oil, Horlicks, such kind of things, and those things cause his weight more, and he became more fatty. One day, what happened? Suddenly, Tricky fall ill, and she had to call the doctor. And our major next character is Dr. Harriet. Dr. Harriet was veterinary surgeon from the same city. One day, when he was driving the car, suddenly he saw Mrs. Humphrey along with the Tricky. Tricky and Mrs. Humphrey, they were walking on the road. Mr. Harriet, Dr. Harriet stopped his car, and then he saw that how fat that dog was. That time he had advised Mrs. Pumphrey that please cut down his food and make him exercise little more daily. But she neglected that time, and now he was called by Mrs. Pumphrey by herself. She had to call because Tricky was very loving dog for her and he was ill. That is why it was necessary for Mrs. Pumphrey to call Dr. Harriet. Dr. Harriet was well-known surgeon, veterinary surgeon, and he came to Mrs. Pumphrey's house to collect and see the condition of Tricky. Tricky was very ill. He was just lying on the floor and panting. He had very blood-shed and rheumy kind of eyes. So this kind of character is Dr. Harriet. We have next thing, that is theme of the story. Theme, we have blind love. As you have seen in the character, Mrs. Pumphrey is so much what we can say addicted to the dog Tricky. It is excessive kind of love has been shown in the story. That is why major theme or central idea is blind love. Next, I am going to talk about gist of the story. Now, what is essential part in the story? See, Mrs. Pumphrey, who is very emotional and very rich lady, who could arrange everything for the Tricky, a small pet dog, very small and loving pet dog. She could arrange for him everything like his bed, his eating bowls, his toys, and all sort of comforts for Tricky, for a dog. And this is very important part of the story because the theme is based on this particular part. Why? Because it has been shown excessive love. Excessive love has been shown by the character Mrs. Pumphrey. So gist of the story is which part has been written considering the excessive love. That is, Mrs. Pumphrey is written, Mrs. Pumphrey, the character, is written that way. So that is why that part is very essential. Now I will summarize the whole story. One day, Dr. Harriet was driving, and Tricky and Mrs. Pumphrey, both of them were on the way. Dr. Harriet saw the dog who was like blotted sausage. Now, how he was like blotted sausage? It was very fat dog. That is why he stopped his car and came near to Mrs. Pumphrey and asked, like, how's the condition of dog? So that time she explained, like, Tricky is little lethargic and is not active nowadays. So he suggested you can cut his food and you can give him exercise. She thought that it is not so important. That time she gave up that idea and moved away from there. Doctor had clear concept in his mind. This particular dog is going to come in his surgery because he was thinking about the weight he had put on is too much and very soon he is going to be ill. And same thing happened after certain days. After a few days, Dr. Harriet got a call, sudden call from Mrs. Humphrey for the illness of Tricky dog. And he was called to inspect the dog. Dr. Harriet came and inspect and advised to admit the Tricky for at least fortnight. At least 2 weeks, Tricky had to be admitted. That was essential that particular moment. So student, what happened next? That is, Tricky was taken by the Dr. Harriet to surgery. Now what is surgery? Where the treatment is given. Doctor is giving treatment to patients. It may be person or animal. So here Tricky also was taken to the surgery. Now in surgery there were so many other dogs. When Tricky was taken to the surgery and he was lying on the floor, he was like motionless. There was no motion shown by Tricky. That is why other dogs who were around him went away, thinking that he is not at all interested to play with us. But Tricky was in problem, Tricky was not well, that is why he was motionless. So Dr. Harriet gave him water therapy. Now what is water therapy? Actually, he was not given food, but water for 2 days. Only water he had to survive on. So second day in the evening, Tricky was little bit active. He was showing interest in other things. What happened then when doctor did not do anything but kept Tricky on water only? That is why next day, third day, Tricky slowly and gradually was improving. But what was happening with Mrs. Humphrey? Other side, she was calling him dozen times in the day. Every now and then she was calling him and she was inquiring about the Tricky, his different things, whether he has changed his coat, whether he was given proper food in bowl, and all sort of things. But only answer Dr. Harriet could give, that was the improvement of the Tricky, and that could make her happy. So this way, all these days gone, and he was day by day improving. He was improving, playing with other dogs, running around in the garden, and automatically he was doing his exercise and he was becoming active enough. And whatever food was offered after 2 days, he was eagerly having that among the other dogs. After a few days, he was like a tiger fighting for the meal. You can imagine the condition at the place of Mrs. Humphrey of Tricky and now in the surgery. How he was fighting for meal. In the Mrs. Humphrey's house, he had no work to do but so much of eating. And that made him ill. Because of that, he was not well at all. But here, he was running all around, he was playing with friend dogs, and automatically he was doing his exercise and becoming hungry. And that was making his muscles strong as well. So at the end of 15th day, now Dr. Harriet had to call Mrs. Humphrey to collect the dog, because he was completely fit now. He was muscle dog and he was very much ready to go back to the owner. So that day, Dr. Harriet called Mrs. Humphrey and asked to collect the dog. But in meantime, when he spent 15 days with Tricky, he was also little bit became fond of Tricky, because of Tricky, there were so many things coming from Mrs. Humphrey. Mrs. Humphrey, like so many eggs and wine, and those days gone wonderful. So he was little bit greedy for the dog that time. But he knew very well that Mrs. Humphrey is in love and she is very much connected to this dog, and she won't allow Tricky to be here anyway. So he had to call to Mrs. Humphrey. So Dr. Harriet called Mrs. Humphrey and she came in the evening to collect the dog. At that time, Mrs. Pumphrey was getting down from the car. Same time, even Dr. Harriet was out of the door only. He went to the car and he said, "Do not come out of the car because I'll get your dog." That time, where was Tricky? Tricky was not in the surgery, but he was in the garden playing with the other dogs. Among other dogs, he was like little shiny dog. So quickly he went, Dr. Harriet went to him, and both of them came to the Mrs. Pumphrey. As Tricky saw Mrs. Pumphrey, he automatically hopped on her and expressed his love, barking over there. This way, we have this particular story. What is the moral? What message this particular story is giving? That is, you should show your love, but it should have little or certain limit to it. Excessive love can cause trouble to you as well as to your loved ones. Now, student, whatever story it is you understood now, questions are given at the back of book. The story, you have to answer those questions later on. Thank you very much.